Let's begin with a claim that will sound wrong the moment you hear it. Cheap sex is not entirely a bad thing. That idea makes people uncomfortable, and for good reason. Everywhere you look, people are complaining about the state of modern relationships. They say there is too much casual sex, too little commitment, too few marriages, too few families, and too much confusion between men and women. And there is truth in that. Something has clearly changed. Over the last several decades, sex has been heavily devalued. A long time ago, sexual access was often exchanged at an extremely high price. For many men, the cost was a lifetime of responsibility, protection, provision, loyalty, and commitment. Today, in many cases, the cost is dramatically lower. Sometimes it is little more than temporary attention, a few drinks, or a short-lived connection with no larger promise behind it. Most people look at this shift and immediately assume it is pure decline, but that may be too simple. It may be more accurate to say that for a very long time, sex was priced far above its true value, and that what we are seeing now, however messy and uncomfortable, may actually be closer to reality than people want to admit. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what the old price of sex used to do. When sexual access was scarce, heavily restricted, and tied to marriage, men were forced to rise to meet that price. If they wanted intimacy, they usually could not get it cheaply, casually, or without consequences. They had to offer something substantial in return. They had to become reliable enough, disciplined enough, productive enough, and socially acceptable enough to justify long-term investment. In that older system, sex sat behind courtship, obligation, sacrifice, and responsibility. It was not simply a private act, it was connected to an entire structure of expectations. That structure shaped male behavior in powerful ways. It pushed men to work harder, organize their lives, build status, control impulses, and prepare themselves for the role of provider and protector. For a very long time, that pressure may have been one of the strongest civilizing forces acting on men. A man who wanted access had to become a man who could carry weight. He had to prove that he was capable of sustaining more than desire. He had to demonstrate some degree of order, competence, and endurance. And yes, many people look back on that era with nostalgia. They see long marriages, large families, and stable social roles, and they assume that the emotional foundations were always noble and deep. But that reading is often romanticized. Many of those unions may have lasted not because the bond was unusually pure, but because the alternatives were limited. People often stayed together because social pressure was intense, because divorce carried enormous stigma or was not realistically available, and because sexual desire had very few legitimate outlets outside of marriage. In other words, some relationships that now look admirable from a distance may have been built partly on scarcity, compulsion, and lack of choice. That does not mean the old system was worthless. It means it should not be idealized without examining the economic logic underneath it. When something is artificially scarce, its exchange value rises. For generations, female sexual access carried a very high price because it was culturally protected, socially rationed, and biologically consequential. Once birth control, changing norms, and looser social structures entered the picture, that price changed dramatically. The old bubble burst. What had once required a lifetime contract could now often be accessed at a fraction of the cost. This is where the argument becomes uncomfortable. Most people hear that and think only of loss. They see the collapse of a system that once pushed men upward and conclude that everything about the change must be destructive. But there is another side. A lifetime of protection, provision, and commitment is an enormous price to pay for sex alone. In fact, it may be an absurdly high price. It may be that for centuries, men were overpaying for sexual access because the market conditions left them no alternative. If so, then modern sexual devaluation, however chaotic, may not be pure moral decay. It may also be a correction. And corrections always reveal something people do not want to see. When the price of a good drops, behavior changes. No one pays more than necessary for the same thing. If men historically worked so hard, in part because sex was locked behind a steep cost, then once that cost falls, the incentive structure changes with it. Naturally, many men stop striving in the same way. Naturally, some become lazier, less ambitious, less disciplined, and less willing to accept heavy responsibilities in exchange for what they can now obtain more cheaply. That is not mysterious. That is exactly what economic logic would predict. This is one reason modern society is witnessing a crisis in male motivation. When one of the strongest incentives for male self development weakens, the downstream effects are massive. If the reward can be accessed without the older level of effort, many men will choose the cheaper route. They will not build more than they need to build. They will not sacrifice more than they need to sacrifice. They will not carry more than they need to carry. And once enough men make that calculation, the culture begins to shift around them. Standards drop, expectations change, the loop feeds itself. So, yes, cheap sex carries a real cost. It can reduce the pressure that once shaped men into more capable versions of themselves. It can weaken the old path from desire to discipline. It can create a world in which short term gratification displaces long term formation. That is the negative side, and it is real. But that is only half the story. Because once sex becomes cheaper, something else happens at the same time. Its value as a bargaining tool declines. And that changes the balance of power between the sexes in a profound way. If a woman can no longer rely on sexual access alone to secure deep commitment from a high value man, then she is forced into a different kind of reality. The old strategy loses strength, the old leverage weakens. What was once enough is no longer enough. And whether people like it or not, that creates a new demand for female development, just as the old system once created a demand for male development. That is the silver lining hidden inside the discomfort. When sex was expensive, men had to become more in order to deserve access. When sex becomes cheap, women may have to become more in order to deserve commitment. That is not a moral judgment. It is a shift in market conditions. And once you see that clearly, the modern landscape starts to make more sense. And this is the part many people still resist because they are trying to operate with yesterday's assumptions in today's marketplace. For a very long time, many women could depend on one central strategy: offer sexual exclusivity, and in return receive commitment, provision, and protection. That strategy made sense under older conditions because sex itself carried enormous exchange value. If access was rare, then access could command a premium. But once sexual access becomes common, casual, and easy to obtain, the equation changes. The same offer no longer commands the same return. That is the heart of the argument. It is not that sex has no value, it is that sex alone no longer carries enough value to purchase what many women still hope to receive from it. A high value man, especially one with options, is not likely to exchange a lifetime of commitment for something he can obtain with very little cost elsewhere. That difference in valuation is so large that it changes the entire negotiating landscape. And once that becomes true, women can no longer rely on sexuality as their primary asset if the goal is not just attention, not just desire, not just temporary access, but stable commitment from a man whose life already has momentum. This is where many people become confused. They think that because men are easy to attract sexually, men must therefore be easy to secure romantically. But those are not the same thing at all. Sexual access and commitment are not identical goods. A woman may discover that getting attention is simple, getting intimacy is possible, and getting pursued is common, but getting chosen consistently by the kind of man she truly wants is an entirely different matter. The difference between being desired and being kept is the difference between price and value. One can be cheap, the other often is not. So once the historical value of sex falls, women face the same kind of pressure men once faced, the pressure to become more than the minimum. And this is where cheap sex may actually produce an unexpected benefit. It forces clarity. It forces the question that older conditions allowed many people to avoid. Beyond sexual access, what exactly do you bring? What value do you create in the life of the person you want? What kind of experience is it to be with you over time? What burdens do you remove and what burdens do you add? That shift is significant because it pulls the conversation away from fantasy and toward reality. A woman cannot simply assume that because she is educated, professionally accomplished, well traveled, or financially independent, a man will automatically value those traits in the way she does. Those qualities may matter in certain contexts, but they are not self interpreting. They are not automatically compelling simply because effort went into acquiring them. The person on the receiving end decides what is valuable, not the person offering it. That principle applies to both sexes. In attraction, no one gets to dictate market demand from the inside of their own self image. That truth can feel harsh, but it is also useful. A man who cannot attract the women he wants is usually told, directly or indirectly, that something is not working. He is expected to improve. He is expected to become more attractive, more confident, more socially skilled, more disciplined, more capable, or more successful. Very few people tell him that he is perfect exactly as he is, and that reality should simply adjust to accommodate his private sense of worth. The marketplace gives him feedback, and he ignores it at his own expense. The same principle applies here. If a woman believes she offers everything necessary for commitment, yet repeatedly fails to secure commitment from the type of man she wants, then reality is giving feedback. The response to that feedback cannot merely be indignation, self-protection, or insistence that the market is wrong. The more productive response is curiosity. What are these men actually choosing for? What do they value in daily life, not just in theory? What makes a woman easy to build with, easy to trust, easy to return home to? What qualities create peace rather than friction? What traits add warmth, support, charm, flexibility, and emotional steadiness instead of complication, demand, and instability? Because once sexuality alone no longer closes the deal, those other dimensions matter much more. Is she kind? Is she pleasant to be around? Is she emotionally controlled? Is she supportive? Is she interesting? Is she funny? Is she cooperative? Is she adventurous? Does she make life lighter or heavier? Does she create unnecessary conflict that wipes out whatever strengths she does possess? These are not abstract questions. These are practical questions. And they matter because long-term commitment is not awarded for potential resume or self-description. It is awarded, when it is awarded at all, for lived value. That is why cheap sex may contain a silver lining, not because it makes relationships easier and not because it removes the pain and confusion of the modern dating market. It does neither. Its possible benefit is that it strips away an illusion. It exposes the fact that sexual access, once detached from scarcity, is no longer enough to command extraordinary returns. And when that illusion breaks, women are pushed toward the same confrontation with reality that men have always faced more openly. If you want better outcomes, you must become more competitive for those outcomes. In that sense, cheap sex may do for women what expensive sex once did for men. It may create pressure for development. It may force women to ask what they are really offering beyond their bodies. It may compel some of them to become more relationally skillful, more self-aware, more cooperative, more grounded, and more capable of contributing to a man's life in ways he actually experiences as valuable. And to be clear, this does not mean surrendering identity or becoming fake. It means understanding that commitment, especially from a high-value man, is not granted because a woman believes she deserves it. It is granted because she offers something rare enough, pleasant enough, and stabilizing enough to justify the exchange. So the modern market creates a reversal. Men no longer have to become extraordinary just to gain sexual access, in many cases. Women, on the other hand, may increasingly have to become extraordinary to secure meaningful commitment from the men they most desire. That reversal is jarring, and many are still psychologically unprepared for it. They are using a historical script in a market that no longer rewards it. But whether they resent that change or adapt to it, the underlying logic remains the same. When a former bargaining chip loses value, you either find new value to offer or you accept weaker outcomes. That is the new reality. And facing reality, however uncomfortable, is always better than clinging to a fantasy that the market has already abandoned. So, no, this is not an argument that cheap sex is wholly good, and it is certainly not an argument that it comes without consequences. It clearly weakens old incentives, destabilizes many expectations, and creates confusion in the space between desire and commitment. But it may also contain one important corrective. It forces a more honest valuation of what men and women are actually trading for and what they are not. For a long time, men were pushed to improve because sexual access was expensive. Now women may be pushed to improve because meaningful commitment is expensive. That is the hidden shift. And once you understand that, the modern dating world looks less like random chaos and more like a brutal form of feedback. The old rules have changed, the old assumptions no longer hold, and anyone who refuses to see that will continue to misread the market. That is why cheap sex is not all bad. Its silver lining is clarity. It reveals that attraction alone is not enough, sex alone is not enough, and past valuations are not guaranteed forever. In the end, the people who adapt to reality will always do better than the people who cling to nostalgia. And whether anyone likes that truth or not, it is the truth that modern relationships now demand.